Okay, so electrolysis comes from splitting using electricity. In electrolysis, you have a cell, two electrodes, joined by a wire with a power supply. In the cell, you also have a solution or molten salt, which is the electrolyte. Which has to contain mobile ions. The electrons flow from the power supply into the negative electrode, which we call the cathode. Okay, the cathode, the electrons flow down into the cathode. The other electrode, where the electrons are being pulled away from, is the positive electrode, which we call the anode. In the solution, we have ions. So normally we would have positive metal ions and negative non-metal ions. The positive metal ions are attracted to the cathode, and when they get there, they accept electrons from the electrode, and in the process of doing so, they get reduced. At the anode, normally the non-metal ions are attracted towards the anode, and when they get there, they deposit their electrons, and in the process they are oxidized. So we have oxidation happening at the anode and reduction happening at the cathode. Now, in normal circumstances, at the cathode, the metal will be plated on, and depending on what the non-metal is, it's going to appear at the anode. Often it'll be in the form of a gas, so you'll see little bubbles appearing at the anode. The electrolysis of copper sulphate is slightly different. The setup is exactly the same. We have our cell with two electrodes joined by a power supply with an electrolyte solution, which in this case contains copper sulphate, which has copper 2+ ions in it. We're not too worried about the sulphate ions. The sulphate ions are spectator ions in this reaction. So at the cathode, the reaction happens exactly as you'd expect. The copper 2+ ions arrive, they accept their electrons, they get reduced and turn into copper metal, which is a solid. So you get copper plating onto the cathode. But at the anode, something slightly different happens. So the key about this electrolysis reaction of copper sulphate is that the electrodes themselves are made of copper. Now, that doesn't make much difference at the cathode, but at the anode, if the electrode itself is made of copper, the copper can be oxidized. So what happens at the anode here is that the copper metal, which the electrode is made out of, will lose its electrons and turn into ions. So the copper anode will gradually disappear the ions, as the metal atoms are turned into ions in the solution, and then those ions are reduced on the other side and are deposited onto the cathode. So if you let the reaction run, what happens is the anode disappears, the cathode gets thicker, while the concentration of copper ions in the solution doesn't change at all. So that's the electrolysis of copper sulphate.